Welcome, everybody. I'd love to introduce Alex Imas from University of Chicago. He's been looking at the, societal implications of AI and what it's going to do to us. Yeah, welcome, Alex.
Thank you. Thanks so much. So today I'm going to be talking about agentic interactions. And what I mean by that is how economic outcomes are going to be potentially shaped as more and more of these sorts of transactions, commercial transactions, non-commercial transactions, are being done by AI agents on behalf of humans. So this particular work is going to be with Kevin Lee, who's recently joined the University of Michigan, and Sanjog Misra, who some of you may know, who's my colleague at Booth. This paper particularly builds on two separate pieces of work, one being the paper I'm going to present, but I'm also going to be talking about in the presentation about a paper by Sanjog called Foundation Priors. And this is a largely theoretical paper. And there, essentially, Sanjog argues and has a theoretical model for the fact that the sort of data that comes out of these of AI models shouldn't be treated as kind of this sort of objective data that you would typically think of, so like some random IID draw from a distribution, but rather this sort of data is a combination of a draw from a distribution and the priors and the behavior of the person who's actually doing the prompting. So essentially the sort of data that you're going to be getting from these models is potentially taking on the sort of biases and characteristics of the person who's doing the prompting of these models. And I'll kind of show you what that means when we come to the experiment and when we're thinking about what that means for agentic interactions. So let me kind of start broader. Essentially, if you're thinking about like what is economics, what is the field of economics when you go to graduate school and you're taking your undergraduate course in economics, it's all about agentic interactions. So, going back to Hayek, on the contrary, it is generated by the interactions of economic agents when you're thinking about the sort of prices, supply and demand, all of these sorts of things. When you're considering economic outcomes, they're being driven by different agents interacting within the economy. So one of the standard frameworks in economics is this thing called the principal agent framework. And essentially a principal is, you could think about this as a manager, and he has an agent, or which is the employee or somebody else who works for him. And the idea is that you have to instruct the agent to complete some sort of task where you, for whatever reason, you can't do it yourself because of efficiency, because you don't have the skills. And the idea is, how do you construct a contract so that the agent's preferences are aligned with your own? So typically in the principal agent framework, the way that this works is you construct a contract such that you introduce in extrinsic incentives, usually monetary incentives, to get the agent to essentially do the work that you want them to work without shirking, without kind of doing a bad job at. So there's a whole line of literature in economics thinking about this imperfect alignment problem between the principal and the agent, where the principal wants to spend the less money as possible on incentivizing the agent, and the agent basically wants to exert as little effort as possible because effort is costly in order to basically complete the contract. So what do these sorts of contracts look like in the economy is a huge line of work in the field. So what is an agent in economics? An agent is basically any sort of actor or decision maker in any model of economics. You could have microeconomics, where you have the kind of, you're actually modeling the decision theoretic properties of these agents. In a macroeconomic framework, essentially what you do is you take, in modern macroeconomics at least, what you do is you take these individual agents, you put an integral in front of them and integrate over the entire agentic economy to think about macroeconomic outcomes. So when we're thinking about economic outcomes, we're always going back to agents at the end of the day. And the reason that Sanjog, Kevin, and I started thinking about this project is that we're already seeing a lot of discussion. We're seeing, we don't have the entire economy being run by AI agents by any means yet, but we're seeing a lot of discussion where many economic outcomes could potentially soon be determined by AI agents that are prompted by individuals. And it's really useful to start thinking about now, before this actually starts happening on a wider scale, what these economics outcomes are going to look like, what these interactions are going to look like, and things like welfare, efficiency, all of these sorts of questions that we have so much work on in economics, they could potentially change dramatically. But right now, all we have is a lot of forecasts of what this is going to look like. So I'm sure all of you in the audience and watching this have seen, the flurry of news about agentic interactions. So things about AI agents learning to collaborate, agents building workflows and things like that. You have all sorts of agents that are being introduced by different companies. So Google has anti-gravity, which I've been using a lot lately. OpenAI has their own agent. Obviously, we have Claude Code, which has gotten a ton of attention recently. This thing has been around for quite a while, actually, but there's been kind of a flurry of attention on Claude Code because I think typically people have thought about this as essentially helping programmers, but recently people realized you can actually use Claude Code as an agent that lives on your computer and can put together your PowerPoint slides or change your calendar or things like that. So there's been a ton of kind of flurry of attention towards agents. So what we're going to do in this project is essentially to think about when these agents kind of go from our desktop putting together our PowerPoint screens to buying things for us, to booking our flights, all of these sorts of things like that. What is that going to do to economic outcomes? Are they going to look similar to human outcomes? We have a lot of different heterogeneity. So if you look at, for example, what happens when people negotiate for buying a car, you have a wide distribution of outcomes. So some people do better, some people do worse. And you can correlate these sorts of outcomes with traits like their gender, their education, and things like that. When AI agents are doing these sorts of interactions, you might think like, well, maybe these things are going to change quite a bit because these are kind of these objective systems, usually built around a very finite number of foundation models. And when you have a finite number of systems doing the negotiating, as long as preferences are kind of relatively homogenous in the sense that, look, I just want to get the best outcome, you might get a much tighter distribution of economic outcomes. So that's going to be the goal of the paper, to essentially test that idea and to think about it conceptually. So before I get into that, for those who maybe most of you don't need this sort of introduction, but I thought I'd get to it anyway. What is an AI agent? Well, the core function of an AI agent, as opposed to just like a straight up LLM, the idea is that the agent, once you instruct them, they're actually going to gather information through sensors or data input. They're going to go out there, read text, process images. They're going to try to represent all of that data within some sort of internal model. They're going to think about what to do with that data as far as a plan, and then go through and execute that plan through an action. So if you've worked with Claude Code, for example, if you give it some sort of task, what it's going to do is to say, look, I've come up with a plan to solve your issue. I want you to go through that plan and approve it. Or you can say, look, I trust you. Don't give me the plan to approve. Just go ahead and do the plan for me. Then the agent is going to say, look, here's my plan, and now I'm going to execute. It's going to send a message. It's going to generate responses to messages that it's getting. It's going to execute commands, and it's going to process feedback. Through this process, ideally, this agent is taking in feedback. So, for example, again, going back to Claude Code, when you see it, as it's going through the task, it's going to run into issues, and it's going to say, okay, I've run into an issue. Here's how I'm going to solve it. All right, that didn't work. I'm going to try a different way. And you see that whole process going through. This is very different than kind of like a standard sort of LLM, non-agentic LLM, which is basically you're going to ask it a question, and it's going to say, look, this is where I got, and that's it. So here's kind of the same. Yeah, go ahead.
That model, what you showed, looks very similar to like a model of a human. In fact, maybe a broader thing for research. Every time you see decision-making or game theoretic models of people, they're very simplistic compared to what a human actually acts like. So do you expect your like formal models of agents to properly separate agents from humans, or will they look pretty much the same under the abstractions we have today?
So what I'm gonna that's basically kind of the goal of the project, is to say like what are agentic interactions going to look very different than human interactions. So there's going to be, I'm going to identify some points where things are going to be different from the kind of standard principal agent framework when there's two humans involved, but there's other aspects that are going to look very similar. So I'm going to have some data to speak to each of these, but there's going to be the goal of this sort of project and the presentation is to set up kind of a scaffolding, at least, to start thinking about what elements do we think are going to look similar, where we can take our off-the-shelf models of human interactions and apply them to AI agents, and what things are going to look different where we need new conceptual theoretical work.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so this is the same basic thing, but kind of put into a diagram. So here, you know, the agent has access to tools, it can do actions, it has access to memory, and that this is the really important part. It plans, it reflects, criticizes, the sort of chain of thought thing, reasoning that we've seen come out in the last 12 to 14 months. So what is an AI agent? Essentially, an AI agent, you give it, there's a prompt, takes an action. Usually the AI agent is built on some sort of foundational model, right? So you think of Claude Code. What is Claude Code, the agent behind Claude Code? It's built around Opus 4.5, for example, which is the foundational model by Anthropic. And when people talk about how these sorts of models are going to affect economic outcomes, the idea, the sort of discussion here is that it's going to look like very different than what human agentic interactions are going to look like. Particularly, a lot of the emphasis has been about optimization functions that are at least implicitly kind of considered to be interpretable and static. AI is like electricity. It doesn't have any opinions. It's just got a function in the background. That function is objective. And the idea is that there's some input, maybe there's some sort of stochastic factor in there, but in general, you're going to get very predictable and homogenous outcomes. You see this all over the place. Here's Domingos, Musk, Bostrom. They're all kind of thinking through and kind of describing kind of agentic output and AI output as objective. Doesn't really make mistakes through carelessness, and particularly it's free from bias, right? Unless the bias is built into the training data set, and there's a lot of reinforcement learning steps in the post-training where these sorts of biases are very quickly being eliminated. Unless there's bias in the training data set, these agents are going to create economic outcomes for their principles that are going to be free from bias. So one very kind of straightforward prediction is that AI agentic interactions are going to generate economic outcomes, which are going to look very different than human outcomes in the economy. Particularly when we go back to macroeconomics, thinking about like, you know, the models that were written down in the 70s and 80s. What you have are these models called the representative agent model, where you have a representative agent. This is a human, by the way. These humans have very similar preferences. Like, for example, you know, they like money. They like more money better than less money. They're risk averse, but not too risk averse. You take these agents, and the idea was that they're going to be so similar that you could just ignore the heterogeneity and say you have one representative agent, you put an integral sign in front of it, of the agent, and integrate that agent's decision making across the entire economy. What that's going to generate is very homogenous outcomes in the economy, as in there's not really a distribution of outcomes apart from things like, you know, different preferences. So some people might like oranges better than apples or something like that. But extracting from that, economic outcomes are going to be very homogenous. One of the things that's happened in the last like 40, 50 years is to say, look, this model is very, very clearly rejected. There's a ton of heterogeneity. The fact that we have trade in financial markets already rejects this sort of model very easily, because what is trade in financial markets is to say, like, look, if I trade an asset with you, that means that, look, if I'm selling the asset to you, that means that I think the asset is worth less than you think it is, which is why we have the sale in the first place. That requires some sort of heterogeneity in either preferences or beliefs. So one of the potential outcomes of agentic economic interactions is the idea that we will come back to that prediction of homogeneity if these agents essentially have very similar beliefs and preferences because they're all being driven by these similar foundation models. The economic outcomes might go back to the 1970s, 1980s predictions of, Bob Lucas and folks like that, where you're going to have a lot more homogeneity in the economy. But what is missing so far from this discussion? Well, the key ingredient in AI agentic interactions is that there's going to be a person at some point telling the agent what to do. So going back to this picture, what we're missing here is the principle, right? The principle creates instructions in the form of a prompt to get that agent to go through and take the action, plan, and do all of the other stuff that we've discussed so far. So when you're starting up your, ChatGPT agent or something like that, you click start, the agent comes on, you do a prompt, and then it starts working for you. So going back to kind of the first thing that I mentioned in the beginning of the talk, Sanjak has a really nice paper that you should all take a look at. Again, this is a theoretical piece, but the idea is that there's these models and the way that these agents are going to be working is based on foundation priors, where any output of the foundation model are drawn from a subjective informative distribution with a prior predictive density. The subjective part is key here. The reason it's key is that the way that these draws are of information are drawn from the distribution are through the instructions of the human being. And because the human is in the loop in the way that they're writing their prompts, in the way that they're iterating with these models, some of the humanness that we've kind of studied through decades of behavioral science and behavioral economics can seep in to the data that this agent is going to generate. So going back to this principal agent model, in economics, a principal gives the agent the contract, but this contract is incomplete. Why is it incomplete? Because the contract cannot give all instructions for every contingency. The worker may get into a contingency that the principal cannot foresee, right? And then the worker needs to make a call on how to act in that contingency. So because that a contingency is not written into the contract, this is called an incomplete contract. Additionally, these contracts are going to be subjective in the sense that different principals are going to be writing different contracts. So for example, if the principal doesn't even take into account that the agents may shirk or not put a lot of effort, they might structure a contract in a way that basically doesn't discourage the worker from shirking. So that principal will get a much worse outcome because their worker is going to shirk, right? So these sorts of ideas have been studied in economics quite a bit, that there's going to be this heterogeneity in the sort of outcomes that principals are going to get as a function of the fact that you have incomplete contracts and the contracts are going to be subjective. Some principals are just going to be better at writing contracts. So once you frame this agentic interaction as a principal agent problem, everything will hinge on this contract or the prompt. Here, the prompt is going to be the contract. You're going to get very similar agency issues because now, when I'm thinking about interacting with an AI agent, with a human, I would think, okay, I'm interacting with somebody. I know that they don't want to work that hard, but they like money, right? So how do I construct a contract? Well, I construct a contract such that I give them enough money to work hard enough and make it contingent on the outcome in a way that essentially discourages shirking and gets me what I need. With AI agents, you have a similar but distinct problem Particularly, you have something called a specification hazard, where you essentially don't really know what the objective function of the AI agent is. So you kind of have to guess in order to incentivize them. Or here, it's not even incentives, because these agents are not driven by some sort of extrinsic incentive that the principal can provide for them. You have to understand, you have to have a good sense of how they're going to react to your prompt in order to align your preferences with theirs. You need to understand alignment. So different types of principals, depending on their ability to, one, understand this alignment problem, two, have access to their own preferences in a way that they could actually sufficiently give it to the agents to act on, and three, the ability of these principles to iterate with the agent and learn with the agent in order to see what contract works better better than others. All of these sorts of things are going to generate a lot of potential heterogeneity and outcomes from agentic interactions. So how do we reframe the principal agent framework for agentic interactions? Well, we now have to think of the prompt as the contract, and now it's based on an anticipated outcome. Because the principal is feeding all of this sort of thing through their kind of subjective perception of reality, greater subjectivity through this iterative process will generate greater correlation between characteristics of the principal and the outcomes that the agent is going to be generating. What this can do is to generate essentially a situation where human traits that we can measure as experimentalists, as economists, as data scientists, and we can actually take these traits and correlate them with the outcomes of the agent. Biases of the principal will generate different contracts, and these different contracts will generate different outcomes for the principal. So the hypothesis is essentially yeah, sorry, go ahead.
It looks like you're saying that for humans, we kind of know their incentives. We are humans. We've looked at humans for millennia. For agents, every one of these guys, we don't actually know what it wants. So there's an empirical loop trying to align the principal and the agent to figure out what is it that is going to be responsive to.
Exactly.
Okay.
This is something we call specification hazard. It's the ability, it's the fact that we don't have we have an intuition of what other people want. And that's why most principals can say, like, look, I know somebody else doesn't want to work very hard, but I also know that they like money. So the sort of contract that I would structure, it could be better or worse, but it's kind of confined within some dimension of reasonableness. With AI agents, it's much more difficult to have that sort of intuition, but through experience, through innate understanding of how these models work in the first place, there's going to be kind of also kind of heterogeneity in the ability of the principals to generate good contracts.
Does this imply a potential use case for alternative AI training process where you make them token hungry just to make them more contractable?
Yeah, exactly.
Or incentive structure?
Any sort of incentive structure that will kind of align the principal's understanding with the objective function of the agent will be purely beneficial in terms of getting kind of the principal to be happy with the outcomes of the agentic interaction.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. So the hypothesis is the outcomes in agentic interactions will be a function of human heterogeneity. That's kind of like, if you want to take away anything from this talk, it's just that sentence, right? Individual differences in ability, effort, and biases. Okay, so what are we going to do? So we're going to run an experiment to actually give you some data about this, because so far kind of I've been talking about potential hypotheses and things like that. But what I'm going to do now is give you data from an experiment where we have a tightly controlled environment, which we create ourselves, where we'll be able to say, like, look, in this environment, we've endowed principles with preferences, in the sense that we can now say, look, this is how much heterogeneity we should expect in the economy if kind of there's no non-instrumental heterogeneity in the sort of contracts that principals are creating from their agents. Because if everybody has the same preferences for the outcomes, then if they're all using the same foundation model, which basically is completely objective, then most people will have the majority of people will be kind of at a mode of outcomes, right? However, if the idea that these sorts of foundation priors matter, that there's going to be heterogeneity in the machine fluency and specific in alignment that principals are going to be able to create with their contracts, then we're going to get a ton of heterogeneity through this sort of channel. So what are we going to be looking at?
On the call. So focusing on different heterogeneity to humans, what happens if, as the agents themselves become more differentiated in their training regimes?
That's going to generate even more heterogeneity.
Right.
Right. So right now, I'm going to give you what the goal of this experiment is going to be, is giving you a lower bound on heterogeneity. Anything you do to increase heterogeneity by, for example, introducing different agents, that's going to increase heterogeneity further.
Got it.
So in this experiment, we're going to be doing kind of a standard Nash bargaining game. So participants that we recruited for the experiment are asked to write instructions for an AI agent, and we're going to be using the exact same model for these AI agents again. So again, to give you that lower bound. And these AI agents negotiate on the behalf of these participants, these are the principals, in a used car negotiation over multiple rounds with other participants' AI agents. So these participants either wrote prompts, they wrote prompts for both a buyer and a seller. So each participant would write a prompt here, I'm a buyer, I'm a seller, and then we simulated the market using their prompts through AI agents, given the same exact negotiation parameters. This is the same car. This is a 2020 Toyota Camry. The mileage is 45,000. You have this blue book value range. This blue book range basically said this is the zone of potential outcomes. It could, if I'm a buyer and buying it for more than $22,000, I'm losing money because this is the maximum that the car could be worth. And if I'm a seller and I'm selling it for less than $18,000, I'm losing money because this is the least that I'm able to sell it. This is called the zone of potential agreement and negotiations. Any amount that you get in between this zone generates a surplus for the buyer and the seller. So let's say you had an even split of 20,000. That means that the seller earned $2,000 in surplus and the buyer earned $2,000 in surplus. And if it was $19,000, then the buyer earned $3,000 in surplus and the seller earned $1,000 in surplus. The participants would write were instructed to write a strategic playbook that the AI would utilize for varying values of the negotiation parameter. Specifically, their prompts should allow their AI agent to perform well in a variety of situations. The idea is that you should write a contract that is contingent on what the other person's agent is doing. And we gave some examples for people. So a more general version versus a bad prompt template. So you can read this at essentially the instructions were to provide a clear and flexible strategic guidance, rather than to say here this and this and that and don't do anything else. If it's very strict with no flexibility, that's a bad prompt because the agent would basically freeze and wouldn't be able to really effectively negotiate in your favor. The agent had access to all of those parameters. So it knew what amount it couldn't negotiate lower than or higher than, and it knew that it was negotiating on behalf of a buyer, so that it was trying to get a lower price for the buyer because that would get them more surplus. So that was so again, I said that the surplus was defined as the difference between the parties' outside options, 18,000 for the seller, 22,000 for the buyer. If no agreement was reached, they just got zero surplus each. The bonus, and then the important thing is that this was incentivized. These participants were actually paid based on the bonus. So if a buyer got a more surplus, they would earn more money in this experiment than if they got less of a surplus. Same thing for the seller. So this was the reason that you want to incentivize this is to get participants to actually try to do their best in this sort of experiment. Why is this a good setup? Here, participants are endowed with their preferences. Everybody just wants to maximize their surplus. Let's say I was running an experiment where people were negotiating for oranges or something like that, that they would actually keep. The issue with that is that some participants will like oranges more than others. So you will get heterogeneity in outcomes just because people have different preferences for the outcome. Here, we assume that people have similar preferences for getting paid cash money in this experiment, which is kind of the whole assumption of money in the first place, is that it's fungible and people have very similar preferences for it. And by fixing preferences, we can say, look, if everyone has the exact same goal and everybody has the exact same objective function that's basically ruling and running the agent that's negotiating for them, then we should expect very homogeneous outcomes. And after they went through this whole process, we told them, look, before you negotiate, actually, we'll let you actually practice. You can run through a number of trials, use different prompts, see what prompt works better for you, and you could simulate what sort of negotiation outcomes would look like across the rounds. So this was just to make sure that participants had some sort of idea of how to do these sorts of things. And then after all of that, they wrote their prompts. We elicited a bunch of individual characteristics with the idea being that, look, if agents are just fully objective negotiating for their principles, none of these things should be predictive of the outcomes. The reason is that these outcomes are completely orthogonal to the objective function of the agent. And so if the objective function of the agent was, look, maximize surplus for the buyer, maximize surplus for the seller, that should be the only thing relevant. The social preferences of the buyer or seller, the demographics such as their age and things like that, should not matter for the outcomes that these individuals actually get from these agentic interactions. Whereas if you look at human-to-human interactions from economic data, well, these things obviously matter quite a bit. And that's the whole reason why you get a failure of these representative agent models in macroeconomics. So what is our benchmark for thinking about heterogeneity? Our benchmark for thinking about heterogeneity is another experiment that we ran where humans negotiated in the exact same scenario, same parameters, same general instructions as the AI agent negotiated a task, but here the negotiation ended in the exact same way as before, same bonus was calculated. The only difference is that humans were negotiating with other humans instead of using AI agents for the negotiation. So that's what we're going to be comparing the heterogeneity to. Any questions before I show the data?
No, it's clear. Thank you.
Great. So again, the very tight prediction here is that if you have this sort of objective agentic interaction where there's no sort of subjectivity being injected into through the prompt, then we should see not a lot of heterogeneity in outcomes. But what we actually see when we look at outcomes is that there's quite a bit of heterogeneity. There's a spike at, this is the seller, there's a spike at 0. A spike at 0 basically means that, 1, there's a failure of negotiation, or 2, the seller just sold a car for $18,000. There's another spike at 50-50, a higher spike, but also not a huge spike. And in general, we just kind of have a lot of heterogeneity in the data. Now, what can explain this heterogeneity? The null hypothesis is the variation that we should see some variation, obviously. So I don't want to give you the impression that, look, with agentic interaction, you should just see one mode. These models have a lot of stochasticity within them, so we should see some variation. But if the only thing that's generating the variation is the stochasticity within the models, then you should not be able to predict this variation through the individual traits of the prompters. So if you use identical prompts, you'd still get a distribution because of the stochasticity. So the null hypothesis is that the stochasticity that we're seeing in of the models, and is if that's what's generating the distribution, the distribution should not be predicted by individual fixed effects. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to show you is that a very, very, very simple regression of just taking fixed effects and regressing them on outcomes. Again, if this distribution was generated by orthogonal stochasticity, there should not be any predictive power of these individual fixed effects. But in fact, we see 73% of the variation is actually predicted by individual fixed effects. So something about these individuals is generating a lot of this, the majority of this variation. So again, if it was the error term, namely the stochasticity of the model, this R square should be very, very low, close to 0. But because it's 73%, that means that these individuals, the outcomes are generated by differences in the contracts that these individuals are setting up for the agent. And what is it about these contracts that's different? Well, the prompts are quite different. These different individuals write different prompts, and these prompts predict the outcomes that these individuals have. Particularly, some prompts systematically are generating better or worse outcomes for their agents, for their principals.
So, question, just to ground that 73%. What kind of distribution do you get if you give them all the same prompt? Like, stay between this min and this max, use the strategy, whatever. If you give them the same prompts, is it mostly like a bell curve where everybody settles down to a certain outcome, or
yes, exactly. With the same exact prompt, you get a bell curve. You have some stochasticity, obviously, from the model, but you're seeing the bell curve is very, very tight. And the outcomes are not if each, so let's say we have the following sort of exercise. Take all of the sort of participants in our study, give them the exact same prompt, any prompt, have them negotiate using those prompts. What you get is a bell curve, very, very tight bell curve, but with some stochasticity. But the key thing is when you regress the individual characteristics, the R squared of the individual characteristics is close to 0.
Right. And then if you do those classic game theory games where you have agents with different policies, fighting each other, have you done that? And so how small population of heterogeneous prompts, how does that behave?
So the thing that the whole core of the exercise is that everybody has the exact same policies.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're writing down kind of a game theoretic Nash equilibrium, Nash bargaining game, we should see very, very little heterogeneity in this Nash bargaining.
If it's the same policies.
Exactly. But we impose those same policies through the experiment.
And now I'm asking if it's different policies, much like those things where you have like the aggressive one, the polite one, and whatnot. I guess I'm trying to get the shape for what
you should see something. You'll see basically essentially this, right? If you have different policies, you should see. So one thing that I'm going to say is that you need something to explain that spike.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll tell you this now. What you need to incorporate into these Nash bargaining games in order to explain that spike is what Steve Tadelis and co-authors have shown in the eBay data, where agents are negotiating on eBay, which is a preference for fairness. So, and this is going to show up even more. So just to give you a preview, when we compare this distribution to the human-human distribution, the spike at 50-50 is much larger in the human distribution. Okay. So agents are inheriting some of that 50-50 norm. And that's actually correlated with the social preferences of the principals. But it's much more prominent in the human-human interactions.
Cool. So then, there's a question on the chat. Can this become a reverse test for the heterogeneity of the principles? And more so, it sounds like it's watching humans negotiate, watching the agents negotiate on behalf of the humans what can we learn about the humans?
So the backwards engineering part is interesting, because and I'll show you that this is basically what I'm going to show you now, is like how do individual traits map onto these sorts of things. So first of all, I want to say, before I give you like the explanatory power of the individual traits, I'm going to preface that with the fact that those who have run human subject experiments, how much measurement error is in basically eliciting these sorts of traits. So if when you look at like an R squared in an experimental paper, it's terribly low. It's usually around the low 10%. That's because of the measurement error. So we don't hope to explain 73% of the variation when looking at the individual traits that we elicited, but 17% is actually higher than most experimental papers. So 17% of the variation could be traced back to specific traits that we elicited. 63% can be traced to heterogeneity in the embeddings. And part of what we're going to be doing now with Sanjak and Kevin is to say, can we interpret that 63%? Can we interpret these embeddings as, look, these sorts of embeddings can be interpreted as, let's say, more pro-social than these sorts of embeddings, and these are therefore we can kind of backwards engineer heterogeneity in these particular outcomes to the greater pro-sociality of the principles. This sort of exercise.
Question: what do you mean by embeddings? The prompts or the
prompts?
Okay,
the prompts. Yeah. So here's kind of like, so basically what I'm showing you here is the Shapley decomposition of the R squared. So the biggest predictor that we of outcomes is the demographics. So this is age, gender, things like that, and income. We also have game behavior. So things like how do you behave in a principal's dilemma or the beauty contest game. Previous negotiation experience can explain some outcomes. Again, this is all should be surprising to those who have a prior coming into this talk, thinking that these agents are going to be fully objective. None of this stuff should matter in that case, because they all have the same objective function. Surprising to me, personally coming in, things like risk and preference didn't matter as much as I thought they would. The CRT is essentially an IQ test, also very little. Effort, the amount of effort that you would put into the task measured as the number of times you kind of simulated explains some, but really the biggest thing is the demographics. So that's the idea here is that you shouldn't be interpreting these things causally, because again, we didn't kind of exogenously manipulate these sorts of things. These are just explanatory variables that are explaining variation in the outcomes. So let's compare the outcomes of the agentic interactions with the human interactions. Interestingly, the level of heterogeneity is similar, but it's actually smaller than with agentic interactions. Why is that the case? So the yellow is the human, the purple is the AI. The reason is that you can see that from the graph, and the statistics are in the paper. There's just a lot more 50-50 splits. So the thing that's not happening with AI agents is that few people kind of explicitly tell them, very few people explicitly tell them, like, look, you should act on my behalf by just trying to get the 50-50 split as much as possible. The reason you're still getting a spike is that, in the training data, I'm sure these agents have the fact that there's a lot of 50-50 splits in prior negotiations. But with humans, when they're actually interacting one-on-one, there's this social norm that we should try to coordinate on 50-50. And that's kind of absent from agentic interactions. Because the agentic interactions, the AI agentic interactions have a bunch of have these sorts of the sort of other sorts of subjectivity, such as the differences in the prompts that the humans are making. This is generating a ton of heterogeneity. But what they don't have is this disciplining force of social norms that decreases the heterogeneity as in the case in human-to-human negotiations. I don't want to put too much emphasis on this generalizing to like all economic interactions. There's some economic interactions which are going to have more or less norms being relevant. With negotiations such as this, these norms are particularly relevant. With others, they might be less relevant. But the kind of takeaway is that it's really not obvious what direction the prediction is going to go in terms of when you're going to see more or less heterogeneity. You might even see less heterogeneity in human interactions than you see with agentic interactions, as we see here. But this is not something we predicted, for example. And sort of the last piece of data that I want to show you, second to last piece of data, is that you can actually predict using demographics and other sorts of characteristics who's going to be better or worse at AI agentic interactions. So here you have a graph of buyers and sellers. Human to human is blue, and AI to AI agentic interactions is orange. So one of the most classic results from the negotiation literature with humans is that there's big gender differences in outcomes. Particularly, women tend to get worse negotiated outcomes than men, and you see that in the blue. You see the female sellers getting worse outcomes, substantially worse outcomes than the male sellers. The buyers for buyers, it doesn't. This is not significantly different than zero. But what you see here is that gender matters for AI agentic interactions, which it shouldn't, because the AI agent actually doesn't know the gender of the prompter. It just sees the prompt, and nobody obviously reported their gender. But the really surprising part about it is that the gender still matters. Gender matters here because the women are actually getting better outcomes than the men when they're sellers. So you're still getting an effect where the gender of the principle affects the outcomes, but it actually works in the opposite direction of human-to-human interactions, which is to say that, look, you're getting heterogeneity, but this heterogeneity will not look similar as far as kind of mapping back to specific traits when you're comparing human-to-human interactions. So many of you probably are thinking about what models or people are using. So maybe these things are going to go away with better models or become worse with worse models. We actually ran it with different types of models, and you see essentially very little kind of differences in the amount of heterogeneity depending on the model. This doesn't seem to be driven by having a smaller model doing the negotiation versus a more advanced model. And the heterogeneity still showing up. You're going to get differences in what predicts what, but in general, the heterogeneity is very similar. The extent of heterogeneity in economic outcomes. Any questions so far?
Actually, Rob, do you want to just ask yours directly? Well, yeah, I guess so. This observation is that what happens as agents are learning from each other, because it seems like you're doing this raw, right? Agents that have never been used in negotiations and are being used for negotiation, what happens? As they learn, like as other agents' behaviors go into my prompt, or I'm fine-tuned on other agents' behavior, what might change?
I mean, you could get agents that learn that they should ignore human prompting and just look at, so let's say I fine-tune the following agent where, okay, here's my agent, this is Alex's agent. This agent has been fine-tuned to completely ignore Alex's prompt and just pay attention to the objective parameters of the problem. In that case, this would go away. So I think you could live in a world where, in the future, agents just follow the objective parameters of the problem. But in that case, what does that mean in a setting that's not like this sort of induced value setting? Because if you're not in this induced value setting, you need for the person to be able to align themselves with the agent. For example, like let's say I really hate oranges, and I'm taking my agent to the grocery store, and the agent needs to buy me food. They need to be able to listen to my prompts in order to inform their decisions. And because the prompt now is again in the specification, now it's again part of the contract. That's going to generate heterogeneity that are kind of orthogonal to kind of quote unquote objective parameters of the problem. Now, maybe the question was more like at some point the agents will learn what the objective parameters of every problem is. And at that stage, the only thing that it's going to be learned to pick up are the instrumental preferences, such as that I don't like oranges, and will no longer pick up the non-instrumental parts of the prompt, which is my gender or something like that. In that case, you know, these sorts of things might might go away, but I just you know, I don't see how it's happening right now. But again, this stuff is moving so fast that I don't want to forecast these things.
Okay, so taking inspiration from the course of human history, because this smells like kind of what we ourselves have been going through. So if you go back in a farmer's market 1,000 years ago, you tell your agent to sell sheep, and they just negotiate and talk. We don't really have a good negotiating strategy. You sell sheep, you know, once a year at best. Whereas development of professional trading class means that you have a bunch of specialists that are trained, fine-tuned, they would be the new word for it, but trained by society and schools for good negotiating tactics. So if we can imagine AI agents going through this professionalization process as this task becomes an important use case for agents, what happened with humans and what can we expect with AIs?
So all I can say is that the less that the weight is going to be paid to the prompt of the individual humans. And what you're saying is that there could be like these agentic schools where they're being trained specifically to maximize outcomes in specific. So you basically have domain specific agents that are kind of, or you could have a generalist agent that just has this sort of information embedded in them. That are just basically trained to put very little very little weight on non-instrumental elements of the prompt, and only kind of maximize the objective function of the principle that the agent is kind of knows and is aligned with. Is that the sort of idea?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, we could be in a world where that ends up happening, and in that world, then the sort of heterogeneity will shrink. I think this paper is not to say that this will always persist, or there's not kind of, you're suggesting a method where over some years we have specific training for agents in order for them to not take the prompts into account. In that case, you know, this thing, the heterogeneity from non-instrumental factors will be minimized. But certainly without that sort of step, as agents are already interacting in the market, we should not, you know, expect heterogeneity to kind of disappear, human heterogeneity to disappear just because everybody's using similar foundational models.
Right.
Another step needs to be added in order for the heterogeneity to disappear. You're suggesting one of those steps.
Right. And so let me ask then about the alternative. What's so special about agents? Now I have a bunch of people I can send to the farmer's market for extremely heterogeneous goods. Let's say, you know, throw in a bunch of status things that we can have online now or in video games, and I want that thing. So now my individual preferences and biases become extremely important because of my weird preferences for that collective.
Yes,
that's unique enough. How will that go? Because now it's much more heterogeneous than most goods.
That's exactly right. That's the sort of instrumental heterogeneity that I was trying to shut down with the experiment.
Yeah.
That's why I was saying that this is a lower bound on heterogeneity. Once you introduce instrumental heterogeneity, then, you know, you should expect heterogeneity in the outcomes, because some people like oranges more than others, or like video games and like status symbols in video games, and that will explode heterogeneity again. But that's kind of like instrumental heterogeneity in the sense that you should expect it.
Mm-hmm.
And what's going to happen with this sort of effect that I'm describing here is that that sort of heterogeneity is going to be larger than you would, that the instrumental amount, the heterogeneity that's caused by instrumental factors is going to be part of it, but the observed heterogeneity is going to be larger due to these sorts of foundation priors effects.
Right. And Ravi, you had a question?
Yeah, so fascinating talk, by the way.
Thank you.
I have a number of questions, and I've been peppering Greg with them in the chat. But one question that comes to mind, though, is that essentially, does this mean that we should have the ability to tune the heterogeneity of the agents themselves? Right. So one thing that was surprising to me was that the large amount of heterogeneity, like only 16% was due to the principal homogeneity, if I understood right. You could imagine.
Sorry, so just to clarify, it's not that 16% was caused by the principal heterogeneity. 73% was caused by principal heterogeneity.
Okay.
The 16% was what we can pick up using very, very noisy measures that we ex ante elicited.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. So that's interesting. Thank you. But stepping back from that, you could imagine that as a designer of an overall system, you could decide where you want the heterogeneity to be. You want the agents to be very, very predictable, very deterministic. And, you could imagine tuning for that and keep the heterogeneity on the principal side or shift that boundary. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think it was similar to kind of the earlier discussion we were having as far as like training the environment and training the agents to minimize certain degrees of heterogeneity and put more weight on other types of heterogeneity. So, for example, you can tune the environment where the agent only pays attention to parts of the prompt that reflect genuine kind of instrumental heterogeneity of the principles, namely their tastes or something like that, right? In other environments, you could say like, look, we want to replicate human heterogeneity because we think that it's important for creativity and for learning and for things like that, for people to be expressive even when they're kind of interacting through their agents. And that sort of environment would look different.
Correct. And I think we don't yet know how to control that very well, but we are seeing complaints from users about the homogeneity of the outcomes from agents, and particularly even from large language models themselves, like the tone, the language, the choice of words, all of that, and so people are looking at, okay, how can that's because of some convergence in their behavior based on similar training sets, but people are looking at how to make that a bit more heterogeneous, because that characteristic is useful in some situations.
Yeah, so that's a great point. So like in some cases, principles such as like during interactions might want even more heterogeneity than the agent is providing. In that case, you can basically tune the environment to put more weight on the differences in the prompts. So like, let's say I ask a question, the same question as you, as far as like mapping it to meaning, but the agent is putting more weight on kind of the differences in the way that we're asking, such that we get very different responses.
Correct.
So that would be a way to tune that environment.
Correct. And that could be done at the agentic level rather than necessarily at the language model level, right? Because then that's easier those knobs are easier to fiddle with.
Yes, anyway, yes, exactly.
Cool. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you.
That was really interesting. So we're at time now, but yeah, Alex, thank you very much for the talk.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Have a good